Since Sony announced that they'd be scaling back production of physical Blu-ray games January 2028, we have seen some reports now come out as the fiscal year is ongoing for these different companies, and they're mostly talking about quarter one as you'd expect. But we are, as part of that, where they talk about their revenue, units sold, the just the overall operations of the business. We're getting a bit of a look at the physical to digital split. And in some cases, it doesn't look good for physical games. But it's interesting because I'm noticing that gamers aren't necessarily buying that initial look as they are really diving into some of the numbers. And there's some questions, some side eyes being given at these different companies, and I kind of get it when I go over this because it definitely benefits these companies to we'll say fluff up some of the the digital numbers at least at first glance, especially to investors. But hey, we'll go over some of that here today. So if you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe if you're new. Before I go forward here, I want people to understand I'm not trying to make the case that physical is outselling digital. Digital games, no matter how you look through the numbers, outsells physical multiple times over. In fact, we're going to see that here in a minute. But the point I'm making is when you see people mention 6% physical, 94% digital, 9 to 1, it actually does not seem to be at least at that level. All right. So that's kind of what I have to make the case for here. I think we're talking about millions and millions of customers who would fall into, I'd even say, the enthusiast categories that Sony and some of these third parties are really gambling on right now. But let's start here with Capcom, okay? So Capcom put out their Q1 results. Capcom's doing very well, by the way. And a lot of that has to do with them really focusing in on obviously the Switch 2. They've mentioned, hey, that really helped us. But like PC is insane for them right now. Like they have sold a ton of copies for things like Resident Evil, Monster Hunter's done very well for them. Their back catalog is absolutely killing it right now. But they put out their report here for Q1 of the current fiscal year that they're in, and they have their digital units here. And people were looking at this and wow, it's 93.3% digital for the units. And then people went, man, that means it's 6.7% physical. I guess it does make sense why Capcom's doing this. But then they started looking into it a bit more because they have a little drop down here that shows some of the details. And they go, oh, that's 60% of that is PC. And there's no physical copy available on PC anyway. Like there is actually no choice. That's just a fully digital category for them. What happens if you remove PC from the equation there and you come down to games that you assume would have choice? Although even then, not every game that gets released from Capcom has a physical copy, but let's just pretend like it does, all right? Then it actually goes up to like 18% physical. And it's like, huh, that's a lot different than 6.7%. Well, then it gets a little more interesting because last year, Capcom was, of course, talking about the Switch 2. It had released and it was a big deal, and people were very excited for it from the investors' angle. It's like, man, you're gonna sell all kinds of stuff on here. And to Capcom's credit, turns out they were because they were moving some of their big releases there day one with things like Pragmata. They had Resident Evil, obviously a big one, Monster Hunter Stories 3. And so they were being asked about how they're going to record these things because they're game key cards. That is a big thing, right? And it's such a talking point last year, still now even. Although people have loosened up a bit, lightened up a bit on the game key cards, probably because they see the alternate reality from the timeline split, where Nintendo would have been like, you know what, it's just too much. We're not going to be able to deal with this. We're just all digital. So I've noticed that people are a little more accepting at times of the game key cards now. But the question here was, are key cards for Switch 2 recorded as physical or digital units? Capcom responded, they are recorded as digital sales. Okay, so now let's go back here to the chart. And you go, wait, okay, so what has Capcom released on the Switch 2 that isn't a game key card? I don't think anything. I think everything they've released on the Switch 2 is a game key card. They've released Switch 1 cartridges, of course, that also work backwards compatible on the Switch 2. But all the big games, Resident Evil, Pragmata, they even did a Resident Evil triple pack. Remember that? They were all game key cards. So Capcom recording those, and again, that was to an investor, so they're not lying to them. No, they're telling them straight up, hey, if we're going to record it as a digital sale, the Switch 2 is a digital system to them then, similar to PC. So then you go, wait, what if the Switch 2 was counted as a physical system then with the game key cards? I mean, it does seem like then it would be over 20%. just kind of like as an estimate, I have a feeling the Switch 2, just based on the way Capcom's talked about it, would probably sway the numbers at least a few percent. All right. So it does make me wonder if it's even upwards of like a quarter of their current user base on console who have the option between physical or digital are actually buying physical games. And then there's also coming down to the idea of is everyone a hard line like physical digital buyer? Because I don't think so. I think most people who buy physical also buy digital games, you know? So it's like at times it's whatever's available. Because some of these physical games, we saw what happened with Resident Evil. It was pretty hard to get that game. It was sold out everywhere just about for the first week or two. So I think some people went, you know what, I'll just get it digitally, whatever. I want to play the game week one rather than get spoiled like social media tends to, where you just scroll through the timeline and there's the ending for some reason. Okay, so with that, Sony also released their numbers, and Sony's numbers are so interesting. There's a lot to pull from with their financials. I mean, really. First off, Sony is doing very, very well. I know people are going to try to do things like the boycott that they're trying to do at the end of August, and man, it's an uphill battle because their current forecast coming up here is insane. As in, they are looking for record-breaking numbers for operating income, the whole thing, and a lot of that comes down to GTA 6 is in November, and they are going to profit heavily off of that. And it's going to be so difficult for people to push back in any like conceivable way with that. Again, I think where the Sony could get into trouble is the just overall compounding nature of all these different things that have been ticking away within the PS6 showing up potentially at a heightened price point of like $1,000 or something, right? That's where they could run into some trouble. In the short term, it seems like Sony's going to be making some money. But with their financials here, they do talk about game software, and people looked at that right away and they said, whoa. So this is in billions of yen, okay? So physical software, 125, and then digital software is like 1,055 billion yen. It's always a thing to figure out exactly what this converts over to exactly here. But like that was for the last fiscal year. But you look at Q1 right now. Here's 20.5 billion yen, and then there's 192 billion yen for digital software. That's a pretty big difference. You know, you like can convert it over. It's like 9-1 because I think this converts over to like 128 million dollars. This converts over to like 1.2 ish billion dollars. Yeah, that's tough. But then you start to look at how Sony records this information, and it changes things a bit. So right now we're looking at like 9-1. All right, just rounding. Yeah, sure. Okay, 9-1. Like literally 90%, 10%, right? However, the way that they record physical software on their books, they only record the royalty that they collect. Now, that specifically would be for third-party, first-party games they sell, even physically. They just record the whole amount. But as you're going to see here later on, turns out they sell quite a bit more when it comes to third-party. So let's say they take, 30% gets thrown around. I think it's a little different for retail. We'll just say 30%, all right? They just record that portion of the overall sale. Because they're not at point of sale, they're not dealing through the publisher within the retailer. Remember, they produce the media. Like they do all the work with the Blu-rays and the companies and stuff. And then from there, say Capcom with Resident Evil, they then deal with getting the games out to stores and working with retailers. They're the publisher. You know, they're the ones selling and then collecting the money from there. Digital software, however, because Sony does control the point of sale on that end, you do go through Sony with the PlayStation Store, they record the entirety of the purchase. So they may record 30%, we'll say, of the physical sale. Again, I think it might be a little lower than that. But they record 100% here, and then on another part of their financials, they have added in with a bunch of other stuff, but that's where they would then record the difference, okay? So they are comparing like gross revenue from the 100% of the transaction to like 25 to 30% up here. So then let's say people were going through and like, oh, let's take 30% off the digital software. It's still not going to be incredibly accurate necessarily. It won't be the exact number, but if you do that, it goes from 9-1 to like 3.5-1. All of a sudden we're talking about, oh, is that like a quarter of revenue for physical software? Well, they do, at least if you drop down here, they do give us an indication of it's 82% full game software for the digital download ratio. Now, I still people still have questions is like, hold on, how many of those games, just so we can be clear, do have a physical option? We don't know. That's the thing. It's hard to exactly say because they don't give us an exact breakdown as to every game that sells here. But again, you look at it and you go 82% versus 18%. Again, I wouldn't be shocked if it was over 20% in that regard. And that's again, that's not nothing. Now, the other thing here, I do want to make this point for Sony. They had look at that, 6 million units of first party titles, and they made an incredible amount of money. And when you look at where the money's coming from, I hate to say it, at this point in time for the PS5, I actually don't think they have to release another game if they don't want to. It's because the add-on content, again, they do record this similar to how they record their digital software, where you would remove the royalty out of this. It's still an incredible amount of money that they're bringing in through free-to-play games, expansion passes, in-game currency, whatever else, right? All the other things you add on, and it's more than the digital software and the physical software combined, which is absurd. And then they have network services and stuff. Basically, their first party titles are accounting for a very small amount of the revenue they're generating right now. And it's going to be even less so. I know Wolverine's coming up, and that's going to do well for them. Guys, GTA 6 is going to dwarf Wolverine, like completely. So it once again is going to be heavily slanted towards third party, big mainstream kind of games. And while Sony will have some first party titles, it's just they're very beholden to their third party partners outright for their PlayStation to make money. And of course, it is important for third parties to do well on any of these platforms, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo. But it does seem like more and more that Sony is very reliant on a lot of the mainstream titles and also a lot of the free-to-play games, which the live service stuff, when you see these kind of numbers, it's obvious why Sony became so enamored with it, because it is like the big piece of the pie for all the revenue flowing through their storefront. They've already made mention of that, so it's not necessarily a new thing. But still, when we talk about the physical software here, if we really are thinking that it could be over 20%, it doesn't surprise me, because when I see things like, so Alinea Analytics, okay, they had this that they put out, and I think it was quite interesting to see the differences here between some of these different games. And in some cases, I'm not surprised. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, according to them, estimated, of course, was almost half physical. And the thing with that is they made a concerted effort, Square Enix did, to make sure they had like a true physical game. They put 2 Blu-rays in there, and they did that with Final Fantasy VII Remake as well. So it's obvious that they know their audience is very interested in kind of that collector side, like the collectability, we'll say, of Final Fantasy. And so when I see that, I know Square is thinking, look, if we can move half of that other 50% of the physical over to digital, that will actually make us money. Like, the margin uplift is that significant for them, but it still is, Final Fantasy is a franchise that I think needs to really work to maintain its current like user base, its fan base, because they're just getting older. Like, now more than ever, they're catering to an older audience that I do think looks around and has a PS1 copy of a Final Fantasy game, a PS2 copy, like multiple games up on the shelf, because that does lean into a very enthusiast crowd that has stuck with a franchise for decades. So I don't know, that's a gamble. But the thing with Square is they can go, look, guys, oh, look at us. That's what these third parties are going to do. They're going to go, well, look at it's Sony doing it. So it's going to be really funny when we get to Final Fantasy 17 coming out, and the physical copy, it's a game key card, sure, but it's on the Switch too. That's the physical copy to get, apparently. It's going to be so strange. Astrobot, though, check that out. Almost half of Astrobot. And I think this is a trend, by the way, for Sony's first party games. I think they are. I think if you look at the PlayStation Store, and Sony has this information, obviously, I think a lot of their first party games do trend more physically than most other games on the PlayStation Store. So like Astrobot Spider-Man 2, which is definitely a more mainstream game, at near 35%. Astrobot at like half. I'm very curious about Wolverine because it seems like there's just more awareness around the idea of physical media going away and might be a bit of a push. People might be more inclined to buy it physically. And like I mean, I'll get it physically because like I do like the little shorts unboxings, and I at this point I feel like I'm one of the only people who bought Saros physically. But like I'll get Wolverine physically, and they also made a point to tell people it will be on disc. So I part of me wonders if they also go, yeah, we know that there's a bigger margin in terms of physical media buying for Sony first party games. We have to kind of make sure they know that there at least will be a disc available. But all this really comes back to people just are not buying some of these numbers that are getting thrown around. And in a way, I'm not either, because if it was 7%, and I'm not saying like everybody online is like a big physical collector who has a bunch of games up on a shelf, I don't know if the pushback would be as crazy as it is. The pushback is still going. Just the message that Sony put out, the tweet, has like 100 and I don't know, 80 million views on it, and it's still a thing. And they even had to address it to investors because they were asking. So the margins obviously are a lot better just going all digital. So that's why this is going to be a big push for Sony and, yeah, even third parties who are just going to follow along and basically be quiet about it. But the fact that there are so many people yelling about it online still, I don't know. The numbers, I tend to believe that it is actually closer to like 20 to 25% for physical if you align everything correctly and don't inflate, we'll say, the digital side with games that aren't even available physically and stuff. So again, I think millions of people. I think it's a big gamble. I think it would make more sense for Sony right now to ride out the PS6 generation with like a disc availability, just as options. You could treat them as collectors where it's only through PlayStation or whatever, right? But there is a disc option available. And honestly, they could still scale back on disc production quietly and make it kind of difficult to find the physical media, but kind of let the market work itself out to where eventually, yeah, it is 3% physical. And it's like, guys, I mean, we're calling it, it's the PS7, it's coming up. But I think part of that's also they got to figure out digital ownership, because that's something that's been on I would say on the back burner. I have a feeling they're trying to ignore it purposefully because guess what? That doesn't help their bottom line to let you sell your digital games, trade your digital games. Part of this is also knocking out the used market. So I don't really think they want to figure that out. They like the idea of your game being attached to your account because then you're also beholden to them with your digital library, and a lot of control, a lot of trust for the platform holder in that case. Let me know what you guys think about this one though down below in the comments. With some of the numbers getting thrown around, did you double take when it was being mentioned that it was actually like 9-1 for Sony with revenue, or Capcom when it was 93% digital for some of their stuff? Because that one surprised me a bit, and I looked into it and I was like, I see what's happening here. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.